This would not be possible without them. We greatly appreciate it. Apologies for the Bengals. I know we're quite close to Pittsburgh here. My wife grew up in PA, so she's a Steelers fan. But Joey Burrow is a hometown boy from Athens, from southeastern Appalachian, Ohio. Hometown boy made good, and we really do need to get ourselves positioned to be able to win here with broadband. The way you do that, you identify the problem, figure out where it is, and document it well, and then prioritize where you're going to invest to fix the problem. Find the funding. This is a good time for that. There is a lot of funding coming down the road, as I will talk about later. And then finally, track that funding and enforce it. Make sure that the internet providers who get this money do the work. That has not always been the case in the past with some of the federal programs. So we've got quite the digital desert in Ohio. And I'm going to take this presentation, I'm going to start at the state level, and then I'll focus down to our region and then down to Jefferson County. So if you look at this, the dark red and the orange, those are all areas that are considered by the federal definition to be unserved. So their download speeds are slower than 25 megabits per second. Their upload speeds are slower than 3 megabits per second. The dark red is actually below 10 megabits, so that's really slow. And once you get into the yellow and the light green, that's still considered underserved as far as the federal government goes. So only the dark green is actually well served right now. And as you can see, that's just little scatterings in like Cincinnati and Columbus and Cleveland, Akron area. And this is based on consumer speed tests. So we've got about 9 million results from people just like you who Googled speed test and ran a speed test to see how fast their internet was. And it was divided up into the regions. The state licensed this data. We really appreciate the state doing that. That was really smart, because this is a good way to document what's actually happening instead of just having to take like your internet provider's word that there really is coverage there. I would like to encourage you to take the speed test yourself. You can go to connectingappalachia.org. The instructions are right there. The more speed test results we get, the better this data is. And it doesn't just have to be if your internet is bad. We want to see it if it's good too. We want to get a real world picture of what's going on. So our result here, looking at these unserved areas, about 2/3 of the populated square miles in the state and about 800,000 households do not have broadband. Federal government, FCC, thinks that's about 200,000, but they have admitted since then that their maps are not accurate, that they understated the problem. If you ask Microsoft, they think there's 2 million households that don't have broadband. Regardless of which number, it's a lot. This is really something that boils down to population density. When you look at a place like Columbus, you got 1,500 households per square mile. Even when you get down to a small city like McConnellsville, there's still almost 500 houses per square mile. That's plenty of population, plenty of customers for an internet provider to come in and say, yeah, I'll install fiber, I'll run the cables, I'll eat the cost for it because I know I'll make it back from the business that I'll get. But when you get down into what I like to call the rural expanse, part of why I love this region are the more sparsely populated areas. But you look at like all of Meigs County, it's just under 2% of the population density of Columbus. And when you get into some of the small townships, you're looking at sometimes even less than 10 households per square mile. You're not going to find any for-profit internet provider who would be willing to invest in those areas because they just don't see enough customers to bring back the money that it costs to bring the fiber in. This is not a new issue. It's been around for a century. Back in the Depression era, Communications Act, all people in the United States shall have access to rapid, efficient, nationwide communications service with adequate facilities at reasonable charges. They were talking about telephone service then, but it applies just as well to broadband now. And since 1990, FCC has given over $100 billion to the big telecommunications providers, supposedly to fix this problem. There hasn't been a lot of movement. I like to liken this to roads. If you quit maintaining your roads for a couple of decades, you're going to start to get some car-swallowing potholes. And eventually, it's just going to revert back to being like a goat path, and you're not going to have a road anymore. Unfortunately, that is what has happened in our region. About a half century ago, telephone companies installed copper cable all through the region, and it was great technology at the time, and it lasted well. That stuff has a lifetime of about 30 years. It held up well, they maintained it a lot, but it's now pushing 50 years old, and those folks that put that copper in, they just don't maintain it anymore. Again, nobody has a landline anymore, or very few people do. They're all going to cell phones, so they just don't see it in their bottom line to fix this stuff, so they've just basically abandoned it. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of our broadband traffic would have to travel. If you have DSL, or if you've heard of DSL, that relies on these old copper telephone lines. To stick with the road analogy for a second, if you're building a new road, there is a ton of specifications that you have to meet if you're going to get any state or federal funding. I'm talking like a sheaf of like 1,000 pages of specifications. You can't just say, oh yeah, we're going to bulldoze here, throw down some big number 4 gravel and then pour some asphalt over it. You're going to get, what's your subgrade, what's your sub base, what's your base, what's your binder, what's your top coat. All of this is going to be specified. Unlike that with roads, broadband, that's not the case. All they ask for is a speed target. So you can end up building something and say, yeah, it'll go fast enough right now. 5 years from now, it might not. There's no enforcement on that of having a specific layout of how the fiber works. To give you a sense of why this is important, the internet was invented, the web was invented back in 1990, and every decade since then, you've seen a 10-fold increase in the bandwidth that people expect at a well-served location. So back in 1990, people were only at 1/10 of a megabit. It was hardly anything, little modems, if anybody remembers those. By 2000, it was up to a megabit. By 2010, it was up to 10 megabits per second. That 25 megabit threshold that I was talking about that the FCC uses right now to say that you don't have broadband if you're slower than 25.3, that was relevant in 2012. Right now, well-served areas, people can expect to have 100 megabit service. Where are we headed? Who knows? Augmented reality, virtual reality, it's becoming day-to-day stuff. But regardless of what happens, I'm pretty sure that that trend is going to continue. We are going to see 10-fold increases every decade. A lot of the technologies right now won't be able to keep up. DSL, fixed wireless, satellite, they top out at about 100 megabits. So they're fine right now. They'll be good for the next few years, no problem. Cable modems top out around about a gigabit. I've seen some of the companies starting to advertise 2 gigabits, but that's still the current technology. They're not going to be able to go much beyond that. Only fiber optic is the technology that can handle the speeds that are going to be needed in 3-4 decades from now. Are we going to make it to 100 gigabits? That's 100,000 megabits per second. I don't know if that'll be in the home in 30 years, but for sure it's not a stretch at all to think that it'll be 10 gigabits, considering that a lot of people in well-served areas already are buying gigabit plans today. So we need to plan for the long haul. This is like a water system. You don't want to have to go back and dig up everybody's yards in 3 or 4 years because you didn't put enough capacity in. Broadband is infrastructure. You should think that way. Plan starting at about 2025 out through about 2055. And then, in the meantime, look for short-term efforts that can solve problems for people immediately. Fixed wireless is a great one for this. It's pretty easy to put in. You can put up a tower or use an existing tower and get coverage to a lot of folks who didn't already have it. It also makes a great competitive foil to the cable companies or fiber providers. Because if somebody spends the money to put in fiber, or if the government subsidizes it, they're probably not going to subsidize a second competitor to do that. But if you've got that antenna system running, giving an option, then it kind of puts the screws to the companies who have the wired connections to make sure their service is good, because otherwise people would just say, well, I can go with the wireless provider, or I'm happy with this, I'll stay. When I talk about fiber optic, I'm going to throw out some pretty expensive numbers in a moment here. Not all fiber is created equal. So to put in fiber, one of the first thing you need to do is usually attach it to a utility pole. And there's a cost with getting those poles ready. The people in the industry call it make ready, because you're making the poles ready to take new cable. That's going to cost anywhere between $32,000 and $60,000 per mile. We figure it's reality probably about $41,000, because if you spend more than that, it's possible if your zoning allows it, you can just build a new pole network for about $42,000 a mile. And then on top of that, you have to do the fiber itself. Again, about $32,000 per mile at the low end, $40,000 at the high. This is probably going to go up because of inflation, but these were current as of this year. And we do have some real world numbers on these. Neighboring Development District, OVRDC, they had a project recently that happened in one of their counties that did come out at about this rate, so that they were looking at about $40,000 a mile cost for the fiber and about the same for the make-ready. So total cost, you're looking at $60,000 to $100,000 per mile. And the reason for why it's this much, you can get by cheaper. There are fiber optic cables called drop cables. They're the things that connect the poles to the houses usually. Same way like you've got a drop cable for your TV service, or if you're getting a cable modem. Those are really lightweight, they're inexpensive, they don't have a whole lot of strands inside of them, so they don't have a whole lot of capacity, but they have enough, and it's possible you could get away with building a fiber optic network in some of our rural expanse areas with nothing but drop cable. The entire thing could be built that way. Be significantly cheaper than what I'm quoting here. The problem is if you get people moving back to the region, or if you get businesses coming in, more houses being built, you're going to run out of capacity very quickly because you just don't have enough strands in there. So we're recommending beefy cables that have enough capacity both for what's here now, also enough to grow in the future, and if you end up building more cell towers, you can support them as well, because you need fiber to be able to support cell service. We also are speccing good cable, armored cable. Squirrels love fiber optic. Don't know why, they like chew through it, even more so than power lines, probably because they don't die when they chew through fiber. And we're assuming that you have to put things up in the air on utility poles. It is possible to bury this stuff, but if you do bury it, it tends to be more expensive in our region because you hit a lot of bedrock when you try to drill into the ground. So to give you a sense for why make-ready costs so much, you've probably all seen these utility poles when you drive around. The wires across the top, and usually the ones in the center, carry electricity, and then there's a transformer sitting in between them, and then below them is what they call the communication space. And you're going to see those. They're big fat black cables usually. They've got big canisters on them. Those are the splice points where you can pull out connections if you're going to a house or something. Those things, if we string fiber, we've got to maintain a minimum clearance from the ground. So if you put a new cable on there, it's going to be underneath those. And in our lovely area, one of the things that makes it so wonderful are our hills. The hills are rising up, and the stuff sags as it goes through there, so any terrain variation you have, even if it's enough it was flat, you're often going to end up exceeding that minimum clearance when you put another cable on. So you end up having to put in a new pole that's taller so everything can be moved up higher so that you're then still keeping things far enough off the ground. Sometimes, too, just the poles are really old and they wouldn't hold up. Fiber optic by itself isn't that heavy, but when the winter, it gets ice on it, and then it gets really heavy. So when you add that extra ice load, that pole could end up snapping. So oftentimes you'll end up having to replace poles for utility companies. So narrowing in a bit, so the OMEGA region here, you can see that about more than three quarters of the landmass that has population on it, and a third of the households are not served right now. And many of them are at that really bad 10-1 speed. So it's definitely a pretty rough situation. Jefferson County is a little more fortunate than some of the counties. You've got some coverage like around Steubenville that's got good coverage, but still, once you get out into your rural expanse, it's a pretty bleak picture out there. The lines that I just put on top of the map here are what I refer to as middle mile fiber. The blue stuff already exists. They call it middle mile because it sits in between the really high capacity national level pipelines that if you want to call something the internet, that's what the internet is. They connect from that down to the offices of like the local internet providers or neighborhoods, and then off of that you would run what they call last mile, which is the lines that run to every household and every business. Jefferson County is in pretty good shape. There is one section up there in the northwest quadrant where if you see the pink line, we're proposing that if grant money can be found, that they should build more middle mile there in order to make it a better connection to all the surrounding counties and to build what they call rings, so that if somebody's drilling in the ground and they cut one of these fiber links, there's another path around another way that you can go. This is a simplified version, so you can just see at an easy glance, one color, that's all the unserved territory in this region. There is some federal money that was auctioned off back at the end of 2020 called Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, RDOF for short. Federal government loves their acronyms, so I like to say them that way. Jefferson County did not get any RDOF money, so that's not going to help you all. But there is some hope there because there was a lot of money on the table with RDOF. Much of it has not been claimed. Like essentially these companies won the auction in order to get the subsidy, but Charter is one of the few companies, other than a few small, small telephone co-ops or small cable companies that are just very locally oriented. They're the only people who have actually gone through the effort to actually claim the money. So many of the other companies who bid and won RDOF money, we don't think they're going to do anything with it. And now there's word out on the street that it sounds like the FCC is admitting that, and they may pull back that unawarded money and then do a new round to hand it out more effectively. And so that could be good for this area. South Central Power won a bunch of money from the state, from House Bill 2 just recently. For this part of the region, I believe it was $68 million. And you can see that purple, all of that purple, they are going to cover every single household in that space with fiber to the home. Now just a tiny bit of it overlaps onto the southern part of Jefferson County. So again, it's not the greatest news for Jefferson, but there is some potential there. Comcast and Frontier won some money as well. In House Bill 2, I have not mapped them yet because there's all this wrangling going on about the addresses, because the way this money gets handed out from the state, the provider applies and then they give a spreadsheet saying, here's all the addresses that I'm going to serve. Then other carriers have a chance to come in and object and say, oh, I challenge, no, I'm going to serve that place. I already have a plan in here, or I already have service. You just didn't know it. And then after that happens, then they have to redo their address list, remove all those ones that were challenged successfully and submit it back in. And Broadband Ohio is waiting until all of the winning grant recipients sign their agreements and fix their addresses. And once they do that, they'll release the final list, and then we'll be able to map them, so we'll be able to know where the coverage is. At this point, I'm going to switch over to the Jefferson County profile. I'm going to go through this as if you've got the printed copy with you, or if you're following online, it'll be on the screen here. This is the profile that you picked up when you came in. I will go ahead and zoom this out a bit so it's easier to see most of the page. So you've got over a third of the households do not have the minimum speeds. That's 3/4 of your populated landmass. And these color coding on here shows that again closer up, so you can see how there's a lot of unserved. There's a lot of anything in yellow or light green is considered underserved as far as the Infrastructure Act that just got passed is concerned. So that's eligible for money as well from the federal government. So this is actually, in spite of how this sounds like a dire situation, this is a good time for broadband. I really believe that the programs that are existing today and that are getting ready to happen are going to make a major difference. So if you look at the county from a business standpoint, OMEGA was gracious enough to purchase the Dun & Bradstreet data for us for the region. Those of you who are not familiar with them, they track business statistics. So anytime you start a business, Dun & Bradstreet knows about it. They'll send out surveys, the business owners fill them out saying how many employees they have. They also pull it from public record, from like their filings when they incorporate. So we mapped the location of every business that Dun & Bradstreet knows about in Jefferson County. And then we adjusted the dot size to help understand how much broadband demand is going to be present for that. So the bigger the dot, the more broadband demand. We did that through the size of the business. So if they have more employees, that's going to make the dot bigger. Also the kind of business. So if you're like an excavation contractor, you might have 50 employees, but probably 48 or 49 of them are out in the field all day driving dump trucks or running backhoes. They're not in the office needing to consume internet. That doesn't mean that company doesn't need it, but they're probably going to have less demand than a medical clinic that has 50 employees who are constantly on their iPads while they're taking charts and doing stats and things, and that stuff all talks to the cloud now. So there'll be a lot higher demand for medical, education, tech than there will be for some of the like field work, mining, extraction industries, things like that. So this map here shows you the concentration of those businesses and the sizes, and you'll see that There are a lot of businesses concentrated in the white areas, which are served. We just cleared the extra colors out so it would be easier to see. But there are a lot of them that fall over, like in the whole central western portion of the county. You're looking at a lot of places where there are some business with some significant demand who are sitting in areas that are not served right now. That's a good place to prioritize, to think we're not only going to be able to make the case that there are all these residences that need help, but there are businesses who need better connectivity here. And if we want to draw more businesses, we need that there. This is the residential picture. This is not all 12,000 households. It's just not possible to display those in any accurate way on a screen this size. But we were able to kind of combine them in and clump them up enough so that you can see the patterns. This again can be useful so that you can say, well, okay, if you just look at the map based on the color codes by themselves, you'd think like that central Jefferson County right below the served area, like, oh, that might be an area where you'd really want to cover. But then when you look at the houses, there aren't that many houses in there. Whereas up in this section, and that's again, coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, that's where we had a lot of businesses, so that this central western part of the county has got both more population density and it's got business density in it. One final map here, and again, the salmon color is unserved. The white, we just kind of cleared that out. That all, you don't have, like, that's served, we don't have to worry about it. This shows the heavy line. The dark blue line, again, is the middle mile fiber that already exists. All of the finer lines are the unserved roads. So we essentially picked up any road that passed through a census block that was below 25.3, and there's a very good reason for this, because if you're going to install fiber, you need to follow the roads. That's usually where the utility poles are, and that's always where the houses are. So essentially, this is a good shorthand for figuring out how much fiber do I need to put in if I'm going to serve all of the places that need broadband. And for Jefferson County, that's 673 miles of fiber. So what's that going to cost? Total cost about $63.5 million. It's a big price tag, but it is within reason for how this is all put together. We've talked to a number of internet providers to get a sense for how much they're willing to spend. And given the population density in Jefferson County and the terrain, we figure it's a pretty good estimate that they're willing to kick in about $1,700 a household. So internet provider who was going to serve this region, they'd be willing to match a grant up to about $21.5 million. So it's still $42 million that you have to find to be able to close the gap completely. And remember, when I quote these numbers, I'm quoting a robust fiber network that'll last for 30 to 40 years. Lots of strands, big cables, armored cables, and plenty of drops, so that if the effect that we expect to happen from having broadband, if people start moving back to the region, people don't leave, businesses say, hey, we want to locate there, or there's probably a lot of folks who would like to live in this region and telecommute somewhere else, but they just can't because they don't have broadband. If that happens, we need the capacity there to be able to do it. Remember when I was talking about RDOF? This map shows who won the territory in Jefferson County. So the blue is a company called Mercury Wireless. As far as I know, they've never done fiber before they started bidding on this. The pink is LTD Broadband, and then the kind of grayish, very pale blue is a company called Connect Everyone. That's also known as Starry. They're a company out of Denver. They normally do urban wireless. So they find apartment buildings or clusters of buildings that don't have good service inside them, maybe because they're older and no one wanted to pay to run the cables inside them. And then they go in, they wire them up, and then they put an antenna on the roof, and they point it at one of their towers that they have in the city, and they beam it into there, and then they sell it inside the building. Very different model from what's around here. None of these providers has been authorized yet, so like, it's real easy to bid on this stuff. Then once you win, you have to turn in this really big document that talks about the financial capabilities and what you're planning on doing. They've all at least done that much, but the only thing they've done in Ohio is apply to be a provider. We've talked to the utilities. None of them have heard from any of these folks. Like Charter in neighboring counties, they're already building, but they've been talking in any of the places where they won Utilities are like, oh yeah, they've been talking to us about paying for Make Ready. They're actually doing it. So we're figuring that this stuff is not going to end up getting funded, probably get pulled back into the federal, and then they'll redistribute it. It's not necessarily a bad thing because there's a lot of money coming through other programs that are better run than the FCC does theirs. In fact, this is a point where I would like to make that point again. This sounds dire. It is. There's a lot of need out there. But I've been beating my head against this rural broadband problem for longer than I want to admit. And this is the first time I have felt truly optimistic about things happening. The state has a fabulous program with Broadband Ohio. Peter Voderberg runs that. The Lieutenant Governor created the office specifically to bring broadband throughout the state. They are doing everything right. They are moving fast, but from when House Bill 2 got passed, which was what created the program, to when they started accepting grant applications, it was like 3 weeks. Like they hit the ground running, like sprinting, and they continue to do that. Like they are working fast. We've represented a couple of clients in those applications successfully, and the follow-up is exactly what I would want if I had my advocate hat on. It's like they're going by address, not just like census block or something where with the federal government you can get away with serving one house in a census block and then say everybody has service. No, they're saying give us a list of everybody you're going to serve and then we're going to check to see if you did it. They're telling providers they need to do the work within 2 years. And if they challenged as well, they have to do that work in 2 years. So like one of the reasons I think Charter is moving as fast as they are is that they challenged every address that they had RDOF funding for in the House bill so that no one else could get funding there. By doing that, they're signing a contract saying we will put fiber in within 2 years. So great program, it's got a lot of potential. The Infrastructure Act has got, it's going to be between 1.2 and 1.5 billion dollars for Ohio broadband coming down once that gets authorized, and that's going to go through Broadband Ohio. So again, plenty more money coming. Like the fact that Jefferson County didn't see a lot of House Bill 2 money this first time around is not a big cause for concern because there are going to be more rounds with even more money available. So this is actually a good time for broadband. I am optimistic about that. The rest of the section in that report has a detailed breakdown on how we got all this data, how we put these maps together. I'll be happy to go over with that if anyone's interested in it. It's a little more dry material, like I don't necessarily want to read it all to you, but if you have any questions about it, I'll be happy to answer. Might be worth looking at this. This is what when I did that business broadband index, so this is the breakdown of the industries. So healthcare, education, telecom, IT, banking, those are like the big consumers. They're the ones who consume the most. When you go down through in a more mid-level, you're looking at like wholesalers and retailers, transportation companies, childcare complexes. Sports, music, and the arts is like venues. Some of the bigger ones could be big consumers sporadically because they'll have 10,000 people in the venue, and like at Ohio University in their convo, they've got, you can see the little, I know what to look for, but they're these little square wireless Wi-Fi things like every 15 feet up on their scaffolding pointing down at the stands so that when there's 10,000 people in there at a game, they're all able to use the Wi-Fi and not end up in trouble, but then OU's paying for its own pipeline so they can do that kind of thing. You know, down there at the lowest ratings are things like farms, hunting and fishing cabins, energy, raw materials counts is usually what you think of as mining, contractors, folks like that. Again, that's not to say they don't need internet. Farms are becoming more and more automated. Dairy farms especially, they've got all this equipment that now talks to the cloud that helps keep track of how much milk is being produced and like the status of the animals to kind of keep a sense on their mood so that you're not having to be there constantly yourself to see how happy they are. Because as I've learned from knowing, having somebody in my wife's family who ran a dairy farm for their life, it's like your cows have to be happy or you do not get good product. I believe I already went over these costs and distances about how we estimated things. I will warn you with the numbers in that profile, I hope inflation settles down. If it doesn't, it's going to become a challenge for folks who have already committed to building, and then they're looking at like 15% increases in the cost of the raw materials. So that's going to be something that like the funding agencies as well as the companies are going to have to think about. It's like how how to account for this, because this was not at all on the radar when we built these profiles. But some of the pessimistic financial people with some of the internet providers are saying, yeah, we're just assuming it's going to be 15% of the year per year for the next few years. It's like, wow, that gets expensive really quickly. Yeah, and then this just goes over how we calculated our budget numbers. I'll open it up to questions at this point, both in the room or online.
I guess one of the big questions that I have is really, are there areas that you believe would be priority for Jefferson County? We recently were able to help Carroll County submit an application for ARC Power, where you can get up to $2.5 million for broadband expansion. You do have to match that, but your whatever ISP you're working with, they can use part of what the money is, as Sean said here, that they're about what, $1,300 per household or something like that. That can go towards your match as well. So as you go through with looking at these maps, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to do that. And as you know, your ARPA funds can be used for match as well.
We just went down to we had a meeting last week with the broadband task force here, and we are looking for a performance-based, management-based approach to have someone, a company, an entity, a consulting firm, develop the RFP for us, and a lot of these things were put in there. One of the positive aspects of this is that in March 28th, the city of Steubenville had a meeting as to ARPA funds and general discussion, and Mike Dolab, who and their IT person, Zach Murray, are on that broadband committee. He asked for a consideration for the city for $50,000 because I believe that one of the quotes that we had received from a very qualified, very knowledgeable, skilled vendor had indicated it will be about $40,000 to do that. We bumped it up to 50, and I think the commissioners are very seriously and favorably going to consider that. In year 2, we're looking to the city to fund that again. But part of what we have in that performance base is exactly what you're saying. Coming for programs like this for the funding, but also what Sean had said, future-proofing this system, not just saying, okay, hey, we're good now, but saying, how do we maintain it and how do we future-proof it into the future? Because it is a utility.
Yeah, exactly. This is infrastructure. It's got to last.
So we would welcome any involvement, any assistance.
And to help with your planning in the next couple of weeks, we are going to be, that'll be available for you all to use, we can make available to you a Zoomable online version of the maps that I was talking about here. So you're not having to kind of squint at a printout to try to figure out how many businesses are in there. You'll actually be able to zoom in on small areas and turn layers on and off so that you could say, okay, let's look at just the unserved blocks and let's turn on the businesses here, or let's zoom in on this neighborhood, let's flip on the population data and see how many houses actually show up as points.
That's wonderful.
Because I understand the need, like when you're trying to build a project area, you need to be able to get pretty accurate about what's actually there. So we want to make it so you can actually do that.
That's fabulous. Yes. Meet the metrics. Do they have the technical capacity? Do they have the background capacity financially to do this? And there's also consideration of competition. We don't want to just get an ISP in it and they say, okay, well, we've given you 3 great years of service, now we're raising the price. So we have a large, unfortunately at the present time we have poverty within our county and we have to address those issues.
Is anyone in our region
Wi-Fi in their downtowns. But I know one city in particular got some pushback from existing providers, so they're not doing that. But everything else that I've heard, it's all working with the private sector in our region.
In the Medina model, they lease space, right?
Correct.
To the private city. She portrayed like it has to do with commercial.
Right, it hasn't, but they have in Medina, they have a different demographic, they have more people that work there. So it would be it wouldn't just be a capital issue, it would also be a human capital issue.
Yeah, full public, trying to do a full public network, you will get pushback from the carriers because they see it as competition. If a municipality has it, also you need the talent there. It's like a human capital issue. Like, if you end up having to farm out all the engineering and the maintenance, then it may make it harder to make your municipal network sustainable versus if you have people who know what to do on site. It seems like public-private is the sweet spot. Like, maybe the municipality owns the lines, but then they have a long-term commitment from a provider that they're the ones who will actually run the service over them. So that there's that worked really well with like a middle mile network called the Southern Ohio Healthcare Network to connect a lot of hospitals and schools together. SOCAN itself is a nonprofit. It owns the network, but then it leases the right to run that network to internet providers. And then they then can hold those folks accountable because it's like, well, if you're not providing good service, we'll just hand it up, we'll lease it to someone else within the bounds of the contract. But that tends to be a win-win, and it's not like the providers who are running that network object to it. Like, they're happy too because they've got a solid network that they're able to take advantage of and get business through. So you find that win-win sweet spot with getting a company to partner with a government agency.
So what Coshocton County did is what he's talking about?
No, Coshocton is strictly private.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, Coshocton,
Oh, okay.
yeah, for the sake of the folks on online, Coshocton County ended up using their ARPA money to subsidize a fixed wireless provider to put up a number of new towers and then also to attach to a bunch of existing ones as well to serve a good number of new households. And that's more an example of where just like using that ARPA money directly to create a short-term solution that's going to reach people immediately. Because many of these fiber projects, I mean, number one, it's an infrastructure project, so it's a big undertaking. You're looking at a year or two of just constantly working to get the stuff out there because it's just 690 miles of cable you have to lay along with all the electronics and everything. And then also, because all of this, it's kind of a downside of the fact that there's a lot of subsidy money available is there's a lot of subsidy money available, so everyone's buying fiber optic cable right now. So pandemic shortage, pandemic supply chain issues, put that on top of increased demand, the delivery times go out farther. So a good fiber network, you're looking at several years to get it done once you commit to it. Whereas with the fixed wireless, oftentimes they can get those up much quicker. It's just a matter of attaching to an existing tower or getting a permit to put up a new one. It's not cheap. It's not like you're going to snap your fingers and make it happen. You're looking at multiple hundreds of thousands, I believe, to do a tower. And again, inflation's affecting that too with the raw materials.
For ARPA, we have
You have until December 31st, 2024 to obligate, and all funds have to be expended by December 31st, 2026.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, probably the wireless, I think the task force had put that in the RFP. And as a matter of fact, at the last commissioners meeting, the commissioners have engaged a law firm, Bricker and Eckler, to be their ARPA consultant. And
Any questions online or any others from the room? Well, thank you. And Kim Courier.
Yes, he's asking who from Reid Consulting Group is online.
Okay.
Yeah, Tom's online.
He was. I don't know if he's still in there.
We go back quite a few years.
Well, thanks everyone. I will say I'm optimistic about this time right now. This is a once in a probably lifetime opportunity for bringing broadband to this region. Like, things are going to look very different 5 years from now here. I really believe that.